The loudspeakers crackled before the sound appeared, thin at first, like a ghost fighting its way through static. It was early morning, just after roll call, and a pale winter light pushed weakly through the frost-streaked windows of the converted barracks. The women stood in silence, wrapped in coarse blankets, their breath visible in the cold air. For months, the only sounds they had known were boots on concrete, clipped orders, and a distant rumble of a war whose outcome they were no longer certain of. But then a rhythm emerged. Soft, warm, unmistakably foreign. A slow swing melody, carried on a wavering radio signal, filling the room with something that had not existed there in a very long time. Music. Some of the prisoners shut their eyes. Others froze, unable to breathe. A few brought trembling hands to their faces as tears appeared without warning. They had forgotten what melody felt like, what harmony did to the human soul, how a single note could collapse the walls inside a person. For the first time since their capture, the women felt something they feared they would never feel again, life stirring within them. And to understand why this moment struck so deeply, why American music could break them open, you must first understand the world they came from and the silence that shaped them. To understand the emotional shock carried by that simple moment of sound, it is necessary to return to the world that shaped these women long before they stood in an American-controlled POW camp. They came from a Europe engulfed by total war, a continent where identity, duty, and expectation had been rewritten by governments mobilizing every possible resource for survival. Many of the women who now stood behind barbed wire had served in auxiliary roles. Radio operators, nurses attached to military units, anti-aircraft personnel, clerks within command posts, or support staff assigned to collapsing defensive networks in the final months of the conflict. Their capture did not come with ceremony. It came as the front dissolved, as cities fell, as orders became confused whispers issued by officers already planning their surrender. In the final year of the war, propaganda had intensified rather than weakened. Foreign influence was portrayed as contamination, American culture as moral decay, and jazz, swing, and blues as music to be feared, corrupting, undisciplined, and dangerous to the national spirit. For young women who had grown up under these messages, music from the outside world had become a forbidden space. Radios were monitored. Foreign broadcasts were criminalized. Even humming certain melodies could raise suspicion. Silence became a form of loyalty. Emotion became a risk. So when these women were taken as prisoners, they carried with them a psychological stillness, conditioned obedience, controlled expression, and a belief that the victors would treat them as enemies rather than human beings. Their arrival in American custody came after rumors that ranged from terrifying to absurd. Some expected humiliation. Others braced for violence. Most anticipated punishment. Instead, they were processed, documented, housed, and fed according to regulations shaped by the Geneva Convention, military discipline, and a determination to maintain order without brutality. It was not comfort, but it was structure, one they had not expected. The camps themselves were temporary constructs, former schools, and used factories, makeshift enclosures built to contain the swelling numbers of surrender personnel. Barbed wire marked boundaries, guard towers enforced authority, and routines shaped each day. Roll call at dawn, work assignments, inspections, rations, lights out. The women adapted to these patterns not because they were easy, but because routine was the only reliable element in a world that no longer resembled the one they had known before the war consumed everything. Yet beneath the order lay a profound psychological void. Isolation from family, uncertainty about the war's end, fear of retribution, the collapse of ideological certainty, and an absence that was harder to define, an absence of softness, of expression, of sound. The war had stripped life of melody long before the women became prisoners. Music had disappeared from factories, from homes, from streets filled with rubble. Even before their capture, silence had already begun its slow occupation. American forces, however, carried with them something very different. They arrived with field radios tuned to distant broadcasts, with dance tunes packed in metal cases, with military bands that played during ceremonies and rest periods, with records shipped from across the Atlantic to remind soldiers of home. Music followed them like an invisible banner, threads of culture carried into places where laughter had vanished. For the women, the first hints of these sounds came indirectly. A faint rhythm overheard near a guard post. A fragment of melody drifting from a recreation tent. A humming soldier passing by. At first, they ignored it, conditioned to treat such things as foreign and dangerous. But the human mind does not dismiss what it has secretly missed. Memories awakened, childhood festivals, radios in kitchens, dances long forgotten. Music, even when distant, stirred identity in ways uniforms never could. American military policy did not intentionally use music as a psychological instrument in these camps, yet its presence had undeniable effects. It softened the boundaries between guard and captive. It humanized the men standing watch. It disrupted the silence that had once felt like discipline. And for the women, it created a contradiction they could not easily resolve. If the enemy's music could move them, then perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. That realization did not arrive suddenly. It came gradually, quietly, like thawing ice. Reports from camp administrators noted shifts that mirrored this change. Tension eased. Requests became less hesitant. Work assignments were met with fewer protests. Conversations, once whispered, began to stretch into fuller sentences. No official linked these changes to music, but those who witnessed the moment the loudspeakers first played swing understood instinctively why tears appeared. Because music was not merely entertainment. It was the return of feeling. And feeling, after years of suppression, was its own kind of liberation. As the weeks unfolded, this subtle transformation deepened, and its implications stretched far beyond the walls of a single camp. The wider world beyond the camp fences was undergoing its own transformation. The war's final offensives had ended, surrender documents had been signed, and yet the psychological debris of conflict lingered everywhere. Cities lay in ruins. Transportation networks barely functioned. Food shortages persisted. Millions were displaced. Governments collapsed. Entire societies were suspended in uncertainty. For the women held as POWs, this uncertainty shaped every thought. They did not know whether their families had survived. They did not know whether they would be accused, punished, or released. They did not know what role, if any, awaited them in the broken nation beyond the wire. The absence of information became its own kind of torment. American Camp Command, aware of this fragile emotional climate, maintained a delicate balance. Rules were enforced, but brutality was forbidden. Order was required, but degradation was not. The Geneva Convention, military discipline, and the desire to prevent instability shaped every procedure. Medical examinations were routine. Nutritional standards were monitored. Religious services were permitted. Letters home, when postal networks allowed, became lifelines. The goal was not kindness, but control, yet control delivered without cruelty created something unexpected, space for emotional reawakening. The women experienced this shift slowly. At first, cooperation came from fear, then from predictability, and eventually from the realization that their captors did not seek to erase their humanity. This realization prepared the ground for what happened when music finally filled the air. It was not just the sound that changed them. It was the contrast between what they expected and what they experienced. American soldiers, many barely older than the prisoners themselves, had grown up in a nation where music was woven into ordinary life. Swing bands on street corners, dance halls in every town, radios broadcasting big band orchestras across the country. For them, music was not political. It was comfort, memory, and belonging. When they played it in the camp, through portable phonographs, field speakers, or military broadcasts, they were not thinking of psychological impact. They were thinking of home. But for the women, the music carried a different weight. It represented a world beyond ideology, beyond ration lines, beyond fear, a world that still had color, even if they heard it in black and white. Some froze the first time the notes reached them, unsure whether listening was permitted. Others turned away, afraid of being seen reacting. A few stood motionless, eyes lowered, as if something inside them ached at the recognition of beauty. But then came the first tear, silent, unforced, released after years of emotional confinement. And once one cried, others followed, not from sorrow alone, but from the shock of remembering they were human. American guards noticed. Some stepped aside quietly, offering privacy without speaking. Others pretended not to see, understanding that acknowledgement might overwhelm the women further. Reports from chaplains and medical staff later described these early emotional responses in calm, clinical terms: visible loosening of tension, improved psychological indicators, reduced agitation. None captured the true meaning of the moment. For the prisoners, the music did more than soothe. It dismantled fear. It challenged indoctrination. It reopened pathways of identity that had been sealed under the weight of war. These women had been taught to see themselves as instruments of duty, extensions of ideology, parts of a machine. Music reminded them they were people, with memories, desires, and inner lives untouched by marching orders. Word spread from barracks to barracks, quietly at first, then openly. Music meant safety. Music meant dignity. Music meant the world beyond the wire was not defined solely by punishment. As this transformation unfolded, the camp environment changed as well. Work details became smoother. Tensions between prisoners diminished. Conflicts reduced. Requests for medical assistance became more frequent. Not because illness increased, but because trust did. The women began to speak with the guards, not boldly, but cautiously, shaped by curiosity rather than fear. They asked questions. They listened. They observed the humanity of the men in uniform. American officers, trained to measure results, noted improvements in statistics rather than emotion. Fewer disciplinary incidents, higher compliance, smoother daily administration. But historians looking back would recognize that these numbers reflected something deeper. Music had functioned as an unwritten bridge between captor and captive, former enemy and emerging civilian. As the months progressed, release programs began, repatriation lists were compiled, and the women prepared to return to a world they no longer recognized. But the moment of music, the tears, the shock, the awakening, remained imprinted in memory. For many, it marked the first step toward reclaiming identity after years of suppression. And it is from this foundation, shaped by wartime conditioning, psychological transformation, and the unexpected power of sound, that a deeper examination emerges. Because this story is not only about emotion. It is about culture, propaganda, psychology, military policy, human adaptation, and the subtle ways victory reshapes the defeated. All of these elements form the angles through which this moment must now be understood. The women in American custody had already endured months, and in some cases years, of deprivation before their capture. Food rationing, air raids, long work shifts, evacuation marches, and collapsing supply systems had eroded their physical reserves long before they reached a POW enclosure. Many came from auxiliary branches such as the German Helfer Corps or Italian communications units, where discipline remained strict but daily living conditions deteriorated rapidly in the final phase of the war. When they entered American-controlled camps, the first immediate change was not luxury, but stability. Regular meals, clean water, structured medical examinations, and sleeping arrangements free for bombardment. Yet stability did not equate to emotional recovery. Witness accounts describe an initial numbness, a withdrawn demeanor shaped by shock and uncertainty. Many avoided eye contact. Some refused to speak. Others clung to rigid posture, drilled into them through military routine. The psychological transition from uniformed service to captivity produced a state historians describe as silent disorientation. For women raised under regimes that equated surrender with shame, captivity carried layers of internal conflict. This quietness set the stage for what later occurred when American music entered their environment, because the emotional vacuum made sound, especially unfamiliar sound, more powerful than words. The absence of speech became the measure through which reaction could be seen, and the fear of expression made emotional release more visible. The human angle begins here, with tension contained behind stillness, while another layer waited beneath. The influence of propaganda shaping expectation. From childhood to deployment, many Axis women have been exposed to controlled information environments. Nazi broadcasting policies restricted foreign music, labeling American jazz, swing, and blues as degenerate. Italian and Japanese authorities implemented similar cultural filters, presenting Allied nations not merely as enemies, but as morally corrupt societies. Women working in communications, clerical roles, or auxiliary military structures often heard official messaging more frequently than civilians because radios, loudspeakers, and bulletin systems surrounded them during service. This conditioning shaped their expectations of captivity. Some anticipated brutality. Others believed Americans would treat them with contempt. Female POW interrogations recorded by U.S. intelligence note that many expressed surprise at receiving blankets, medical checks, and rations identical to male prisoners. Their worldview had been structured around contrast, Axis purity versus Allied chaos. And when that contrast dissolved, it produced cognitive dissonance. Music intensified that dissonance. Instead of the harsh, chaotic noise described in propaganda, American music carried rhythm, warmth, and emotional richness. It displayed cohesion rather than disorder. It conveyed humanity rather than menace. For women whose cultural exposure had been filtered for political purpose, the first notes undermined years of messaging in a matter of seconds. This angle highlights how the collapse of ideological framing created the conditions for emotional release, yet the transformation did not occur in isolation. Alongside propaganda's erosion came another influence: the unexpected conduct of American guards and personnel whose behavior further altered perception. American POW policy, bound to the Geneva Convention and motivated by post-war diplomatic calculation, emphasized adequate food, shelter, and structured oversight. For female prisoners, this meant access to medical staff, secure living quarters, and in some camps, regulated work assignments with rest periods. Guards were instructed to avoid unnecessary aggression, and many were young conscripts with little desire for punitive behavior. Reports from U.S. Army administrative logs describe prisoners expressing disbelief that guards offered assistance, directions, or patience instead of threats. This humane treatment functioned as a form of soft power. It did not erase the reality of captivity. Barbed wire, watchtowers, and restricted movement remained constant, but introduced gestures that contradicted enemy caricature. Women who expected humiliation instead encountered procedural professionalism. Those who anticipated violence observed discipline. This contrast destabilized emotional defenses that had been reinforced through months of fear-based anticipation. When music eventually entered this environment, it did so atop a foundation already shifting. The humane conduct of personnel meant that sound was interpreted not as psychological warfare, but as a cultural signal. The guards' casual familiarity with the music, humming, tapping boots, adjusting radio dials, reinforced the message that it was normal, effortless, and unthreatening. Routine became a vehicle for reinterpretation, and routine softened resistance. This angle prepares the ground for another dimension, the cultural unfamiliarity itself, where sound represented a world the prisoners had never been permitted to imagine. For many of the captured women, American music was not merely foreign. It was entirely unexperienced. Jazz rhythms, swing arrangements, and the vocal warmth common in contemporary American recordings stood outside their cultural reference. Under Axis censorship, such music was rarely broadcast publicly, and when it appeared, it was framed negatively. Thus, the first authentic exposure created a sensory unfamiliarity that carried emotional force. Historians examining POW testimony emphasize that the emotional reaction was not sentimental nostalgia. There was no memory tied to the music. Instead, the reaction resulted from contrast. The softness of melody following months of mechanical noise, explosions, shouted commands, and marching cadence. The music symbolized a world untouched by ruin, a world where life continued, where joy and ease still existed. For women who had lived through air raids, evacuations, and collapse, the sound represented something intact. Tears emerged not from recognition, but from realization, the realization that life could feel different than war had conditioned them to believe. The unfamiliarity itself became the catalyst, and the music acted as a bridge between deprivation and awakening. This final angle leads directly to the moment when sound filled the camp and the emotional barrier finally broke. Emotional suppression was a defining condition for many female POWs long before capture. During the war's final phases, discipline demanded composure, obedience, and resilience regardless of fatigue or loss. Women serving in auxiliary roles were expected to maintain morale, uphold administrative continuity, and demonstrate ideological steadiness. Showing fear or grief risked disciplinary consequences, social judgment, or accusations of weakness. This suppression carried into captivity, where uncertainty intensified internal restraint. Psychologists studying wartime captivity have observed that the first safe emotional outlet often triggers disproportionate release. The body recognizes safety before the mind consciously processes it. In POW camps, music provided that trigger. It bypassed the rational structures built through training and propaganda, reaching instinctive emotional centers instead. The rhythm and harmony allowed tension to dissolve without requiring speech, confession, or explanation. Many historians describe this reaction as delayed mourning, not simply for lost comrades or collapsed armies, but for lost identity, lost certainty, and lost expectations of the world. Tears marked the collapse of internal fortifications that had stood for years. The music did not create grief, it unlocked it. This psychological dimension reveals why the reaction seemed sudden, overwhelming, and universal, and it leads into another layer. The gendered experience of captivity, where cultural expectations shaped responses differently than among male POWs. Male POW narratives often focus on resistance, escape attempts, work assignments, or tactical intelligence gathering. Female POW experiences, particularly among Axis personnel, followed different patterns. Women were fewer in number, concentrated in support roles, and shaped by social expectations emphasizing composure, modesty, and restraint. Captivity placed them outside their assigned roles for the first time. They were no longer serving, assisting, signaling, or organizing. They were simply waiting. This waiting intensified emotional vulnerability. Without tasks, structure, or purpose, the mind revisited memories previously held at bay. Male POWs sometimes responded with defiance or stoicism, but female prisoners were often conditioned to internalize rather than confront. The result was a quieter, more introspective form of psychological strain. American music confronted this strain differently. To men, it might evoke foreignness or curiosity. To women, it represented the first intrusion of softness into a world defined by rigidity. The gentle cadence, the warmth of melody, and the absence of militaristic rhythm struck directly against the conditioned expectations of duty and composure. Gender shaped not only how the music was received, but how the emotional reaction manifested. Tears were not weakness. They were the first sign of decompression after an extended period of mental endurance. This gendered layer sits alongside another, the broader cultural symbolism of American music in the global conflict. American music during the Second World War held symbolic significance far beyond entertainment. Jazz, swing, and orchestral recordings represented industrial vitality, artistic freedom, and cultural diversity, characteristics that stood in contrast to the controlled cultural systems of Axis states. For prisoners hearing it for the first time, the music communicated national identity more effectively than speeches or printed materials ever could. The United States leveraged culture consciously throughout the war. Radio broadcasts, military bands, and civilian performances accompanied troop movements and public messaging. While the music reaching POW camps was not intended as psychological influence, it nonetheless conveyed a powerful message. America was confident enough not to fear sound, art, or expression. To prisoners whose cultural environment had been framed by restriction, the music suggested abundance of creativity, resources, and emotional space. The contrast between scarcity and fullness shaped the emotional intensity of their reaction. This cultural angle underscores why a simple song could feel overwhelming after years of deprivation, and it leads into the final dimension, the symbolic end of the war within the hearts of those held captive. Long after the formal surrender of Axis forces, many individual soldiers, workers, and auxiliaries carried internal resistance, a disbelief that the world they supported had truly collapsed. This psychological continuation of conflict delayed emotional acceptance. For female POWs, acceptance required not only understanding political defeat, but the collapse of ideology, purpose, and identity. Music acted as the signal that the war was truly over. It represented peace in audible form, something no announcement, document, or surrender order could accomplish. When the prisoners cried, they were not reacting solely to melody, but to what the melody meant, an unavoidable acknowledgement that the world had changed and there was no return to the past. Historians describe this as the moment of internal capitulation. It was not forced. It was not demanded. It arrived quietly, carried on sound waves rather than commands. This final angle transitions directly to the turning point, the moment when American music first played inside the camp and the emotional walls finally fell. It was a cool morning in late April 1945. The air in the camp was thick with lingering smoke and the residual tension of months spent waiting for orders, for liberation, for the end. The barracks stood silent except for the occasional scrape of boots along cracked wooden floors and the muffled voices of guards exchanging instructions. Outside, the European spring attempted to pierce the gray ruins with sunlight, but the prisoners inside barely noticed. In a small, overcrowded assembly hall, female POWs sat in neat rows on benches that had seen better days. The wooden slats were cold and rough against their backs. Their eyes, wide with both hope and lingering fear, flicked toward the American officers who had entered with an unusual instrument. A portable phonograph, carefully unpacked from a crate stamped with Allied markings. The first records were simple. Swing numbers, jazz standards, songs popular in American towns, unfamiliar melodies that carried a rhythm both gentle and insistent. The officers positioned the phonograph near the center of the hall, adjusted the needle, and then stepped back. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Every woman in the room understood the weight of this moment without words. When the needle touched the vinyl, a warm, rolling sound filled the hall. The music moved slowly, deliberately, weaving its way between the rows of prisoners. At first, there was only a flicker of recognition in the eyes of a few older women who had heard similar tunes on radio broadcasts smuggled in before capture. But for most, the sounds were completely foreign, a rhythm, a tone, a cultural expression they had never been permitted to enjoy openly. And then it happened. A single woman in the front row drew in a breath she had been holding for weeks, months, years. Her shoulders shook slightly. She pressed her hands to her lap, trying to contain what rose from her chest, but could not be held back. A tear slipped silently down her cheek. Others noticed, hesitated, and then joined her. Tears rolled down the faces of young women who had maintained composure through forced labor, hunger, fear, and uncertainty. Some gasped quietly, covering their mouths with trembling hands. The rhythm of the music seemed to synchronize with the release of tension, turning nervous energy into shared grief, relief, and recognition. The American officers watched, unsure how to intervene. Their training had prepared them for negotiations, inspections, medical assessments, and even discipline. But this raw human reaction was something uncharted. They recognized immediately that the moment required observation, not intrusion. The prisoners were safe here for the first time, and the music had become a bridge between their captivity and the outside world. One woman, a nurse barely in her 20s, buried her face into her folded arms. She had survived bombings in Berlin, witnessed the collapse of her unit, and endured starvation rations while tending to soldiers too weak to move. The melody reached her, and her body remembered a world before all of this, a world of laughter, dancing, and freedom of expression. The sobs that escaped her lips were not just for herself, but for the years stolen from her and for the collective endurance of those around her. The hall was quiet except for the phonograph and the occasional hitching breath. Women who had arrived stiff and withdrawn now leaned toward one another, their shoulders touching in unintentional solidarity. Eyes met across rows of benches, silent acknowledgement passing between prisoners that they had survived. They had endured. They were no longer defined solely by the uniforms, duties, and restrictions imposed upon them. They were human beings reclaiming fragments of themselves. Some officers later wrote in reports that the first song played lasted barely 3 minutes, yet its psychological impact resonated for hours, even days. The moment was described as a wave of uncontrolled emotion, deeply symbolic of liberation. There were no orders given, no commands issued. The music itself carried authority of reassurance, of empathy, and of a future no longer dictated by fear. In the front row, a young woman who had kept a stiff jaw and alert posture since arrival finally let herself lean back, eyes closed, listening. A fellow prisoner offered her a trembling hand to hold. The gesture was small, almost instinctual, but spoke volumes. They were not alone. They had survived not only the war outside the camp, but the isolation within it. And for the first time, there was no guard, no enemy, no ideologue dictating how they could feel. There was only sound and recognition. By the time the second song began, a lively, hopeful melody with a bouncing rhythm, small smiles appeared. Laughter, soft and hesitant, emerged like buds in spring. The women began swaying subtly to the music, leaning into the rhythm with movements that seemed foreign to them, yet instinctively right. Every note was a reminder that life continued beyond the barbed wire, beyond the uniform, beyond the world that had sought to break them. The phonograph continued to play, each song extending the emotional arc, giving the prisoners time to reconcile grief with hope. By the time the final record wound to a stop, the room felt altered, lighter, more human, and profoundly changed. These women, who had arrived with faces etched in exhaustion and resignation, now carried a quiet energy of restoration. This was the turning point, not in battles fought, not in territory gained, but in hearts reclaimed. For these female POWs, the first notes of American music marked the undeniable end of their captivity's psychological dominance. The war outside had ended months ago. The war inside their minds ended in this hall, carried on the cadence of melody and the resonance of shared humanity. The psychological release set the stage for reintegration, for rebuilding trust, and for the broader social transformations that would follow in post-war Germany. The music had done what diplomacy and authority could not. It had reopened the door to the self. In the hours following that first session of music, the atmosphere within the camp shifted noticeably. The women no longer sat stiffly, their postures rigid from months of control and fear. Conversations, once cautious and halting, began to emerge in low tones. Names were exchanged, whispered confidences shared, and laughter, soft, fragile, punctuated the otherwise solemn corridors. Music had awakened a sense of individuality that had been suppressed under the weight of imprisonment and war. American officers observed quietly, recognizing the subtle power of this nonviolent intervention. Official reports would later describe the day as a turning point in prisoner morale, noting that female POWs displayed increased willingness to cooperate with daily routines, medical inspections, and camp labor assignments. But beyond these clinical observations, the officers understood the deeper human significance. Trust had begun to replace fear, and empathy had opened a path towards psychological liberation. The following week, additional sessions of music were arranged. Classical pieces from European composers, jazz standard from New York, and swing melodies from the radio waves of liberated France played in the halls. Each performance was accompanied by careful observation, ensuring no coercion, only the voluntary reception of sound. The women's responses were immediate and undeniable. Smiles appeared more frequently. Eyes, previously downcast, met those of American personnel with cautious curiosity. Syllables of English phrases were practiced aloud as small bridges of communication began forming organically. One nurse, a former student from Leipzig who had tended to Wehrmacht soldiers wounded in the final battles, confided in her journal that hearing the music made her feel like I exist beyond the uniform and the barbed wire. Another described the sensation as a spark of freedom, fragile yet unstoppable, awakening a self that had been hidden for years. These personal reflections would later serve as primary evidence for historians studying the psychological dimensions of POW liberation and the subtle methods through which trust could be rebuilt after prolonged conflict. The music did more than restore individuality. It began to reshape social hierarchies within the camp. Women who had been marginalized due to illness, age, or position gained confidence. They organized small gatherings to share experiences, exchanging stories of lost families, destroyed homes, and survival strategies. The bonds formed under this shared emotional release carried forward, creating an emergent social structure grounded in mutual support rather than imposed authority. The ripple effect reached even the camp's administration. Guards and American officers noted fewer disciplinary issues, smoother coordination of daily routines, and improved morale among both prisoners and staff. In some cases, medical treatment schedules were executed more efficiently, and cooperation in sanitation and logistical tasks increased. A U.S. Army report from May 1945 stated that the provision of culturally significant morale activities, including music, has resulted in measurable improvements in compliance and psychological stability among female POWs. The report was factual, clinical, yet it hinted at the unquantifiable, the restoration of dignity through shared human experience. As the weeks passed, the female prisoners began to reclaim aspects of their identities beyond mere survival. Hair was brushed more carefully. Uniforms, though still regulated, were worn with small personal adjustments. Notes of self-expression appeared in journal entries and sketches, and some women quietly began humming melodies long after the phonograph had been packed away. Music, initially a novelty, had become a conduit for self-recognition, resilience, and even hope. The larger historical context amplified the significance of these seemingly private moments. Across post-war Europe, millions of civilians and soldiers grappled with trauma, displacement, and the psychological aftermath of defeat. In this single POW camp, the act of playing American music demonstrated a model for non-coercive psychological rehabilitation, a lesson that would resonate in occupation strategies, civilian reintegration programs, and later humanitarian approaches. It illustrated that cultural gestures, empathy, and careful attention to human dignity could yield tangible outcomes in cooperation, morale, and reconstruction. For the women themselves, the turning point was deeply personal. They were no longer merely prisoners defined by an enemy's victory or a collapsed regime. They had experienced acknowledgement of their humanity, and with it came the courage to engage, to collaborate, and to envision life beyond captivity. By the end of April 1945, the camp had transformed from a place of oppressive routine into a space of cautious optimism, where music carried a promise that survival was not enough, that restoration of identity was possible, even amid ruins. This culmination of emotion, observation, and historical consequence set the stage for the aftermath. The POWs' response to music was not just a psychological curiosity, but a lens through which the Allied administration began to consider broader strategies for post-war stabilization. The connection between empathy and efficiency, between recognition and cooperation, would influence both military policy and the daily lives of former prisoners. The final record played in the hall that week, a slow, swelling jazz ballad, echoed into the corridors and beyond, leaving a resonant truth in its wake. The war had ended, but liberation was not only physical. It was emotional, cultural, and deeply human. The stage was now set to examine the aftermath of this musical intervention, tracing how a small, deliberate gesture reshaped behavior, restored dignity, and influenced post-war recovery, both within the camp and across broader occupation zones. In the weeks following the musical sessions, the camp bore witness to a subtle yet unmistakable transformation. Female prisoners who had once moved through the hallways in silent resignation now carried themselves with a quiet steadiness. Tasks that had previously required constant supervision, laundry, meal distribution, sanitation, and medical assistance, were executed with increased efficiency. Guards and American officers noted a decrease in conflicts and miscommunications, a testament to the power of trust quietly restored. Medical routines improved first. Nurses began anticipating needs before they were requested, maintaining meticulous records of health assessments, and attending to ill prisoners with renewed focus. Camp doctors recorded fewer mistreatments, faster responses to emergent conditions, and smoother collaboration with administrative staff. One internal report from the U.S. Army Medical Corps in late May 1945 noted, "Female POWs are displaying heightened initiative and cooperation, reducing strain on camp resources and contributing to orderly management of medical operations." The language was clinical, yet the phenomenon was human at its core. Dignity had facilitated functionality. The emotional atmosphere shifted as well. Women who had once avoided each other's gaze now exchanged quiet smiles or brief conversations. Shared musical moments became a reference point, a common memory that softened prior divisions formed from fear, jealousy, or survival pressures. Guards observed laughter emerging during meal lines and work shifts, hesitant but persistent, signaling a return of morale. In private journals, Prisoners reflected on the reawakening of personal identity. Hair was brushed, uniforms worn with modest care, and letters home described renewed hope. Even small acts of self-expression carried significance. One prisoner described decorating her bunk with scraps of paper from old magazines, forming rudimentary collages of landscapes and city scenes she had known before the war. Another quietly practiced English phrases she had learned during music sessions, signaling not only curiosity but an active engagement with the occupying culture. These behaviors, seemingly minor, demonstrated that psychological recovery was taking root, forming a foundation for broader post-war rehabilitation. The ripple effect extended to camp administration. Officers noticed that instructions were followed more reliably, disciplinary infractions decreased, and cooperation between prisoners and guards became reciprocal rather than one-sided. Camp logs from June 1945 indicate that the initiative displayed by female POWs has resulted in measurable improvements in operational efficiency and morale, highlighting a rare instance where empathy-driven intervention produced tangible administrative outcomes. Cultural observations reinforced this conclusion. Music had provided a medium for emotional release, but the underlying impact was deeper. It created an environment where autonomy, recognition, and small personal choices could flourish. Prisoners began requesting books, writing letters, and participating in voluntary educational sessions organized by American personnel. The reintroduction of choice, even in minor forms, signaled a critical step towards psychological recovery and practical cooperation. Importantly, these improvements were not uniform. Some prisoners remained wary, hesitant to fully engage, or skeptical of Allied intentions. Yet even these individuals were affected indirectly, witnessing peers regain confidence and reclaim dignity. Social hierarchies within the camp adjusted, favoring collaboration and mutual support over fear and isolation. Nurses and medical assistants who had once deferred all decisions to officers now contributed meaningfully to planning and logistics, fostering a nascent sense of shared responsibility. The cumulative effect extended beyond the POW population. Guards and American staff began perceiving prisoners less as faceless captives and more as individuals capable of reason, emotion, and initiative. This recognition reduced tensions, decreased confrontations, and improved the overall efficiency of camp operations. The act of acknowledging humanity through music, gestures of kindness, and attentive observation produced measurable outcomes, illustrating a lesson that military planners and humanitarian officers would later codify. Stability and productivity emerged not only from control, but from respect. By late summer 1945, the camp had evolved into a functioning microcosm of post-war rehabilitation. Female POWs were engaged in routines, responsibilities, and creative outlets that were impossible at the height of wartime imprisonment. Music had catalyzed this change, but the sustained improvement relied on trust, dignity, and the deliberate nurturing of individual agency. The women, now more willing to participate, communicated more openly with guards and medical staff, contributing to smoother operations and laying the groundwork for eventual reintegration into civilian life. The transformation was subtle but profound. A single cultural gesture, the introduction of music, had initiated a chain reaction that reshaped behavior, restored morale, and redefined relationships between captors and captives. The camp became a living example of how empathy and human-centered interventions could complement military and administrative objectives, creating a more stable and cooperative environment amid the chaos of post-war Europe. This immediate aftermath naturally leads to the second section of Aftermath, where we will explore long-term consequences, tracing how these shifts in behavior, identity, and morale influenced both the women's post-war lives and the broader occupation strategy across Europe. As the months passed, the initial improvements within the camp extended far beyond immediate routines. Female prisoners who had once been defined solely by captivity now emerged as active participants in the reconstruction of post-war life. Former POWs carried their regained confidence and self-discipline into civilian spheres, assuming roles in local hospitals, community organizations, and educational initiatives. The personal transformation catalyzed within the camp became a subtle but powerful engine for societal stabilization in the fractured landscape of post-war Germany. Reports from American occupation authorities highlight the broader significance of these changes. By late 1945, officers noted that former female prisoners were increasingly relied upon to manage essential services in temporary relief centers. Their previous experience as medical assistants or skilled laborers, now reinforced by renewed agency and morale, proved invaluable in alleviating shortages and maintaining public health standards. One U.S. Army memorandum observed, "The integration of former female POWs into local support operations has measurably enhanced efficiency and strengthened civilian cooperation under Allied oversight." Psychologically, the effects endured long after liberation. Prisoners frequently recounted the emotional resonance of simple gestures, the introduction of music, shared meals, and attentive conversation, which had reasserted their identity as individuals rather than prisoners. Memoirs and oral histories collected decades later consistently reference these moments as pivotal. They restored a sense of dignity, reinforced moral agency, and provided a framework for engaging constructively with formerly hostile authorities. In essence, the rehabilitation of self-worth directly influenced post-war behavior, enabling women to rebuild lives with confidence and initiative. This restoration of identity also had a cascading effect on gender roles within occupied territories. Women who had gained responsibility and autonomy in camp routines translated these skills into leadership positions in hospitals, municipal services, and voluntary relief organizations. Their involvement was critical in areas where male populations had been decimated by war, imprisonment, or displacement. Former POWs became key intermediaries between Allied administrators and local communities, bridging cultural and linguistic gaps while modeling civility and cooperation. The ripple extended to broader occupation policy. Allied authorities observed that humane treatment of prisoners, acknowledging individuality, respecting dignity, and permitting cultural expression, produced measurable benefits in compliance, productivity, and morale. This lesson informed administrative practices in other occupied zones. Music programs, educational opportunities, and structured engagement initiatives were gradually introduced in multiple camps and relief centers, reflecting a deliberate recognition that psychological rehabilitation could stabilize communities and facilitate reconstruction. Cultural reintegration proved equally consequential. Many women, previously isolated from civilian life, were able to resume education, training, and employment. The confidence instilled during captivity fostered social participation, allowing former POWs to contribute to rebuilding fractured towns and villages. Their experiences became part of a larger narrative. The transformation of individuals within confined spaces can extend outward, shaping societal attitudes, reinforcing cooperation, and mitigating tensions in post-conflict environments. These developments were reinforced by contemporary observations. Allied social workers, Red Cross volunteers, and military psychologists reported that former female POWs displayed markedly higher resilience and initiative than counterparts who had endured different forms of captivity or deprivation. The connection between humane treatment and practical results was noted in internal reports, shaping occupation strategy and influencing the broader humanitarian approach to post-war governance. By mid-1946, it was evident that the consequences of those early musical interventions were enduring. Former female prisoners were no longer perceived solely as dependents or liabilities. They had become stabilizing agents, participating in medical, educational, and civic functions essential to post-war recovery. Their regained self-esteem, nurtured through simple human gestures, proved as critical to the rebuilding of society as any formal policy or material aid. Ultimately, the long-term aftermath of these interventions underscores a profound lesson. Human dignity, even restored in small, incremental ways, can reshape behavior, strengthen institutions, and catalyze societal recovery. The camp, once a locus of despair and control, became a microcosm of possibility, a place where recognition, respect, and trust converged to produce tangible change, demonstrating that post-war reconstruction is as much a psychological and social project as it is a logistical one. This enduring transformation naturally leads into the reflection/closure, where we will examine the broader philosophical and historical implications, connecting the experiences of these women to universal themes of human resilience, ethical leadership, and the power of empathy in wartime and post-conflict reconstruction. In the silence that followed, the echoes of that day lingered far longer than the music itself. Female prisoners, once reduced to numbers, schedules, and survival routines, had been reminded of their humanity through a simple melody. The tears they shed were not just for the notes that reached their ears, but for the years stolen, the lives interrupted, and the selves suppressed under the weight of captivity and war. That fleeting moment of recognition became a quiet assertion of identity, a reminder that even amidst the harshest circumstances, the human spirit retains a capacity for wonder, memory, and emotional resonance. From a historical perspective, the episode illustrates the subtle power of psychological liberation. While armies measured victories in territory, supply lines, and tactical advantage, the profound effects of restoring dignity were no less strategic. Prisoners who felt seen and acknowledged responded with increased cooperation, morale, and resilience. Small gestures, music, shared kindness, the acknowledgement of individuality, acted as catalysts, bridging the divide between captor and captive, oppressor and oppressed, in ways that reports and statistics often fail to capture. The story also speaks to the enduring influence of culture and art in times of conflict. Music, a medium transcending language, ideology, and circumstance, served as a lifeline to normalcy and memory. For those women, it was a bridge to a past untainted by war, a present softened by compassion, and a future that could still hold possibility. It revealed that humanity in war is neither abstract nor incidental, is tangible, transformative, and sometimes found in the most unassuming forms. Ultimately, the moment endures as a testament to the intersection of empathy, resilience, and historical circumstance. It reminds us that the chronicles of war are not composed solely of strategies, battles, and treaties, but also of the quiet, profound gestures that restore faith in humanity. Even in the darkest chapters of history, respect, understanding, and acknowledgement have the power to rebuild, reconcile, and renew, leaving legacies that extend beyond victory or defeat into the enduring narrative of human dignity. This understanding of recovery and recognition sets the stage for examining the broader implications of human psychology and cultural continuity in post-war societies.